All right, folks, here we are in the Neoproterozoic, and we are ready to talk about Snowball Earth. So this link here is just a link to the video that you'll be watching there that you watched in your previous assignment. We're going to summarize a little bit of it and then go into a bit more detail as well. So Snowball Earth, as you learned, is a time period in the Proterozoic when there were glacial deposits on all continents at all latitudes at a couple times in between 900 and 600 million years ago. So here is a map of the world, and here are locations where glacial ice, and you can see, is on all continents. You can't see Antarctica on here, but you got to trust me that there were glaciers there as well. They represent a variety of latitudes. We can tell paleolatitude in a variety of ways. We can use fossils for paleolatitude. We can use the orientation of iron-rich minerals, which orient themselves along with the magnetic field of the Earth, and basically do a series of plate reconstructions to figure out which latitude plates were located at during different time periods. It's important to note that even during the last glacial maximum, which was at its most extensive about 22,000 years ago or so, temperatures in the tropics really only dropped a few degrees, even though it was obviously much colder and closer to the poles. But this is a time period when there was ice at the poles as well. There are between 2 and 4 pulses of glaciation that have been known to occur during this time period. And I will tell you that when the Snowball Earth hypothesis first came out, it was very heavily questioned. People thought it was super crazy, but over time, over the last 20 to 25 years, the data supporting it has kind of mounted. And so even though it sounds crazy that the whole Earth was covered in ice, there is in fact compelling evidence for that. The good news is that there's no reason to believe that that will happen again in the future. So why? What happened at this point where all of a sudden it got real cold everywhere? So there's a few factors to consider. And one is that, remember, we have a supercontinent present at this point named Rodinia. Rodinia was primarily located around the tropics. So if you remember from our chapter on weathering, sorry about that, there is really rapid, back in 101, there's really rapid weathering in tropical regions because weathering occurs fastest in regions that have a high amount of precipitation and very high temperatures, exactly what we see in the tropics. So that led to really high weathering rates. And so what you're going to see here is a very non-scientific chemical formula. I said this earlier, but chemistry really explains everything. It's so annoying to care about what's going on with every electron, but the reality is that it makes a big difference. So when we have this particular molecule, and this is called, you may remember this from 101, it's called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid forms when water and carbon dioxide react in the atmosphere. So water vapor, right, is a common gas. Carbon dioxide, also common gas, extra common during the during the Proterozoic eon, and it forms this weak acid that is present today in our atmosphere as well. And when that precipitation falls, it will chemically weather rocks, which you can see here is just represented by rock. It doesn't really matter. So when rock gets weathered from carbonic acid, a lot of times there will be calcium that is in those volcanic rocks. So calcium, iron, magnesium, right? And that weathers those rocks, and it will chemically react. So there is this molecule that's often created during weathering. This is called bicarbonate ion. Don't worry so much about this. This is the important part here. So when we weather calcium-rich rocks, that calcium gets transported in rivers and transported into the oceans. It is then available for marine organisms, especially for marine organisms that make their own shells. And we know that their shells are primarily calcite. And calcite, the chemical formula for calcite is calcium carbonate. And look at here, we have both of those ingredients that are pouring into the oceans as we have rapid weathering of rodinia. So rodinia is creating a ton of calcium and bicarbonate in the oceans that is then available to organisms. So an important difference here in the Proterozoic is that there's actually carbonate rock. So that means that the oceans aren't acidic anymore. Now they're alkaline or they're basic. And it also means that we have organisms that have learned the ability to make their own shells. Here's an example of organisms that make their own shells. Now, these are called coccolithophores. I think I'm going to figure out a way to, maybe not. I got to figure something out. So, coccolithophores are really cool. This picture is taken under a scanning electron microscope, and these things are why is this word so long? Coccolithophores. Oh my God. So the organisms that eat coccolithophores are like a millimeter in diameter. So these guys are a couple hundred microns across. So coccolithophores are eaten by foraminifera. And they are made of a whole bunch of little plates. And each one of these plates is calcite. They're beautiful. So this is an incredibly, incredibly small picture. And when you use chalk, what you're basically doing is taking the shells of coccolithophores, like you see here, and foraminifera, and you smear them along a chalkboard. That's pretty much the primary component of chalk, are coccolithophores and foraminifera. Isn't that a beautiful idea? Just taking something's exoskeleton and smearing it on rock to write? It's beautiful. It's a beautiful idea. All right, so the important thing to remember here is that coccolithophores are made up of calcium carbonate. And within calcium carbonate, there is CO2, right? So CO2 is trapped. It's stuck inside here. That's why when we put acid on calcium carbonate, it'll bubble because we're releasing the CO2. So if we agree that carbon dioxide is stuck inside, it's trapped inside these shells. When these shells fall to the bottom, and often very small shells are called tests. When tests fall to the bottom, the carbon dioxide that is inside their shells gets buried, and you take out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, right? If we take out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we are cooling the planet. We're taking off a layer of blanket. And if we take off that layer of blanket, the temperatures will drop. And if the temperatures drop, then the weathering of rodinia starts to slow down, and you start to have a more stabilized climate. But you have that stabilized climate at a cooler global temperature, right? Because the carbon dioxide is now buried and removed from your atmosphere ocean system. All right, so that's one of the things that sets the global temperature at a lower level. The next thing that we have to talk about then is what's going on in the atmosphere. So we have the oxidation of the atmosphere going on, where the continued production of oxygen by stromatolites continues to reduce the amount of methane in the atmosphere. Methane, we know, is a very powerful greenhouse gas. As methane is converted into carbon dioxide, and then carbon dioxide becomes trapped in shells, we undergo a further period of global cooling. Remember this crazy graph that we looked at earlier about the oxygenation of the atmosphere over time? See this really rapid rate of oxygenation right here? That is the time period when we have our Snowball Earth. So we have this rapid oxidation of the atmosphere that coincides with this huge global cooling event. Sweet. All right. The other thing that happens around this time is one of my favorite geological phenomenon, and that is the emplacement of what's called a large igneous province, or a lip. A lip is an area, and this one is called the Franklin Lip. A lip or a large igneous province is exactly what you think it is. It is an area of a lot of igneous rock deposited in a very short period of time. There's less than 100,000 years, which I know doesn't feel like a very short period of time, but geologically it is. So you have this really large outpouring of lava in a very short period of time, and that has a big impact on climate. So large igneous provinces are by no means common, but they're not really rare either. Here's the extent of large igneous provinces distributed around the globe. You can see the mafic ones are not always, but typically found in ocean basins. The silicic ones are found on continents, and I don't really see any of these silicic lips that are back arc related. Maybe I'm just missing something, but there are these huge volcanic outpourings of lava, and they flood. So we talked about flood basalts, and we talked about the Columbia River basalts earlier. I showed you a picture of that. That's right here. The Siberian Traps is the largest known large igneous province, and it coincides with the largest known mass extinction in Earth history that we'll be talking about in a bit. The Camp large igneous province you can see is split across the Atlantic Ocean, and that's because there was a large volcanic outpouring when Pangaea began to break apart, and that's known as Camp. So the Franklin province is not on this map, but I'll show you in a minute. It is the result of a mantle plume about 723,000 years ago. So what that means is that a very unbelievably large pool of magma rose up to the surface, and it thinned out the crust. So there's further decompression melting here. No one really knows why these large mantle plumes occur, but they do. And when they do, they just basically melt their way through the crust and flood the land, which is exciting. So here is where we find remnants of the Franklin large igneous province. Don't worry about this date because this is just dependent on when on the age of the paper that this is first being reported in. So you can see evidence for flood basalts, but by and large, most of the Franklin large igneous province has been eroded away. We can find lots of dike swarms, which is where you had a series of feeder dikes. In this last picture, you can actually see where the feeder dikes are. So a lot of the flood basalts that flood onto the surface have been eroded away, but what we have remaining are these remnant feeder dikes here that were within the crust. And that's what we see crisscrossing across Canada and parts of Greenland as well. So you have this massive eruption of basalt. Basalt is full of calcium, it's full of magnesium, and it's full of iron. So it's that calcium again that we're going to talk about. When these flood basalts begin to weather, they once again are going to weather into a lot of calcium. And those rivers, once they weather away, some of this large igneous province are going to flood into the ocean. They're going to react with carbonate in the ocean, and they're going to be uptaken by shells. More organisms are going to uptake them. And that will result in more carbon dioxide being buried in those shells. And once again, the weathering of the flood basalts results in the pressure, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dropping again, which we know is going to make it even colder. So as the Earth starts to get colder, another influence starts to play an important role, and that's called the Earth's albedo. So in the summer, when it's hot, people tend to wear white, right? Because white reflects heat. And then you don't wear black because black absorbs heat. And that's true for the Earth as well. The amount of white on Earth coincides with the Earth's albedo. So when there is ice and when there are glaciers on Earth, what will happen is sunlight will hit those glaciers and will reflect off the glaciers, and that heat will bounce back off into space, almost like a mirror on the surface of the Earth. That heat gets reflected. Very little of it gets absorbed. However, when that sunlight hits anything that isn't ice, much more of that heat gets absorbed in this case. So the amount of white on Earth controls the amount of solar heat that gets reflected back out into space. So as it's getting colder on Earth, because of the weathering of Rodinia, because of the weathering of the Franklin Large Igneous Province, as that continues to happen, the amount of ice coverage is going to increase. So as the Earth's albedo increases, the amount of ice is going to increase. Very exciting. However, we know that Snowball Earth ended, and it ended for a couple important reasons. And one of those is that plate tectonics is unfazed by what is going on in the atmosphere. What ends up happening is that you continue to have carbon dioxide that builds up in the atmosphere during the eruption of volcanoes. You still have methane that erupts from volcanoes during volcanic eruptions. And so even though we have all these mechanisms that are drawing down carbon dioxide, we also have mechanisms that are going to continually increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the other important factor is that there is less consumption of carbon dioxide because there's less plant life, and plant life is going to suck up that carbon dioxide under normal conditions. But as more and more land masses of the Earth are covered in ice, and as more and more surface water is covered in sea ice, that will do two things. One is that it will decrease the weathering rates on land because the land isn't having a whole lot of weathering because it's so cold. But then the other piece is that there's less photosynthesis, so carbon dioxide continues to build up in the atmosphere. So those are the factors that led to the development of Snowball Earth and also to the end of Snowball Earth. So we just have to finish up with a couple interesting things that also happen during the end of the Proterozoic. And one of those things is that first Rodinia breaks apart and then it sort of reforms. So around 900 million years ago, you have Rodinia predominantly in the tropics, right? So it breaks apart and then recombines in the late Proterozoic to form a supercontinent called Pannotia. And it occurs during a time period sometimes called the Vendian. So it's called the Vendian supercontinent. But basically, Rodinia reassembles about 650 million years ago, but closer to the South Pole. So here you have basically most of the landmass of Rodinia basically migrating closer into colder weather. So that sort of helps with weathering rates, but it's basically the same. Obviously, it's the same continental land masses because they're all in some way involved. But it's called Pannotia. So Rodinia breaks apart, reassembles as Pannotia, and you have another Wilson cycle. And there you have the land masses, primarily located near the South Pole. It fragments about 550 million years ago. That's a pretty typical life cycle for a supercontinent, is that they assemble and they persist for about 100 million years and then break apart. And they break apart, honestly, because they're putting so much pressure on the underlying mantle that usually that actually seems to cause a mantle plume. And the mantle plume comes up, just like we saw at the Franklin Large Igneous Province, and breaks it apart after a while. So one of the most important things that happen as a result of Snowball Earth, which you saw in the video, is that the amount of oxygen really reaches levels similar to what we have today, about 20% oxygen in the atmosphere. And oxygen is fuel for life. So in the end of the Proterozoic, we see the development of a fauna called the Ediacaran fauna. The Ediacaran fauna are the first soft-bodied multicellular organisms that we have really great evidence for. They're made of chitin sometimes. Chitin is kind of the stuff that your hair is made of. And but they're in general soft-bodied, but we have really great preservation in a couple locations. They date about 600 million years ago, so right after these Snowball Earth episodes, we finally have good evidence for multicellular life. So here is a video that talks about why the Ediacaran fauna is so important.
The reason why we've come all the way around the world to look at these fossils is that they represent the first example of large organisms in the fossil record. We know that life existed before the Ediacaran fossils, and we certainly know that it existed afterwards. But they represent a crucial change in the history of life on Earth. For the first time, you can pick up a rock and see an organism in it with your eyes. You don't need a microscope anymore. And While that may not seem like a big deal, large organisms interact with their environment in completely different ways than microscopic organisms. So we believe that the Ediacaran fauna represents a fundamental change in marine ecosystems. And ecosystems basically just means the community of organisms that live in a place, how they interact with each other and how they interact with their environment. So the interesting thing about the Ediacaran time period is it's the first time that we see evidence of animals and complex algae. Before the Ediacaran, we had no evidence of these things existing. And in the Ediacaran, we start seeing evidence. And then right after the Ediacaran is something called the Cambrian time period. And the transition between the Ediacaran time period and the Cambrian time period is often called the Cambrian explosion, because across that boundary of time, we see a huge proliferation of animal and plant life in the world's oceans. So the Ediacaran time period can be thought of as the prelude, the lead up to the Cambrian explosion. And because of this, it's a very, very interesting time period for scientists of all types to study. So paleontologists, geologists, geochemists, paleoceanographers, evolutionary biologists, all of these different types of scientists love to study what happens in the Ediacaran and in the Cambrian explosion, because during this time interval, the scene is set for the rest of Earth history and the rest of life's diversity on Earth.
Good stories. So let's close that bad boy up and go back here. So here's some images from the Ediacaran fauna. So this one sort of resembles a fern. So what's crazy is that, like you heard, no one really knows if there's any living creatures that are still descended from the Ediacaran fauna. It seems unlikely that none of them are, but nevertheless, no one knows. And so this was initially believed to be sort of a fan, and this was something that scientists think kind of rolled around on the bottom until they found this example of Ediacaran fauna. Ediacaran fauna is found in Australia and also in Canada, as you'll see in another video clip in just a second. But here you can see that they're actually attached. So this is now interpreted to be kind of a holdfast for this fern-like creature. But because there's no living relatives, it was really hard for paleontologists to figure out like what it even was they were looking at. Like this particular fossil, is it like a critter that would crawl around like this? Is it a fern that looks like this? Some folks wonder if these were creatures that could actually like move along the bottom, or were they attached? Here is just a video showing you a couple other Ediacaran fauna. They're just wild. It's really cool. There's a lot of cool research that goes on with these.
This slideshow is an overview of some of the fossils known as the Ediacaran fauna, a diverse group of organisms that lived in the world's oceans about 580 to 550 million years ago. While some scientists think that these fossils represent the earliest animals, others think they might not be related to anything still living today. Here we'll show you some images of fossils from Mistaken Point Biological Reserve in Newfoundland, Canada, and from the Flinders region of South Australia. These frond-like forms are thought to have been attached to the seafloor and stood upright in the water column, probably filtering out small particles of food that drifted by. These disc-shaped forms, called aspidella, are thought by some to represent the parts of frond-shaped organisms that attach to the seafloor, and are sometimes referred to as holdfasts for this reason. These ridged oval forms are called Dickinsonia. They range in size from a few centimeters to tens of centimeters in length. Some scientists think that Dickinsonia is related to modern-day animals called Placozoa, a primitive aquatic invertebrate organism. This strange three-branched spiral form is called Tribrachidium. This 8-armed form is called Eoandromeda. The specimen here is from Australia. Eoandromeda is also found in China. This fossil is called Spergina. It has ends that look different from each other, as well as bilateral symmetry, which means its right half is a mirror image of its left half. This small fossil is called Parvancorina. It too has bilateral symmetry. This fossil, called Kimbarella, is often considered to be the oldest bilaterian animal fossil, based on its similarity to some groups of modern-day mollusks. This fossil, called Funicea, is found in Australia and often lived in dense groupings of related individuals.
All right, good times. So, lots of research in Ediacaran fauna, and they've been found in a couple other locales around the globe too. So at this point, guess what? You have finished all of the Precambrian eons. You've finished the Hadean and the Archean and now the Proterozoic. So what I'm going to have you do is an exercise called an eon in review, where you go back through the Precambrian eons and you put things in order. Because think about this. In this class, we have talked about how the Earth was made, how the oceans were made, how the continents were made, and we talked about how now the Earth became oxygenated. And at this point, at the end of the Precambrian, the Earth is really set up the way it is today. It has a similar oxygen level. The sky is blue. There's multicellular life. And from here on out, the processes that we're going to talk about are very similar to the ones that we have been talking about. The exception is that we're going to be focusing much more on life, because a really cool thing happens at the very beginning of the Phanerozoic eon. So it's great to sometimes stop and look back and see how far we've come. And that's what this next exercise is. And it's a little annoying, but it's pretty great. All right, have fun and ask questions when you have them.